Welcome to this online lesson on the civil rights movements of the 1950s and 60s, fighting segregation in education, Little Rock High School in 1957. The aims of this session are to know about the key events in desegregating education, to explain the importance of the Supreme Court in desegregating schools, and to evaluate the importance of desegregating schools in the wider civil rights campaign. Firstly, study this famous photograph. Do now. Elizabeth Eckford, a black student, walks to attend the Little Rock High School. Your task: describe the reaction of the white people in the photograph. And secondly, explain why Eckford is ignoring them. Take a moment to answer those questions, pause the video now, and then press play when you're ready to continue. Well, hopefully we've identified several reactions from this white crowd. The most visible reaction is the woman directly behind Eckford, who is shouting, presumably shouting something very insulting. Just to her right, there's a woman looking with what looks like complete contempt. There's a man in the background with a black collar who seems amused by the whole scene. Notice too that there are soldiers in the background. What are they doing there? Are they there for Eckford's protection or something else? Well, that last point will become clear, and it might not be what you expect. Or perhaps it will. So, let's find out what happened at Little Rock High School in 1957 and why it was so important. Firstly, in Cloak's compendium of annoying old-fashioned words that you need to know, there's desegregation. This word is the opposite of segregation, and it is the process of ending segregation. Integrated. This is a word that means brought back together. In this case, black and white people being mixed. For example, a school would be called integrated if it was for both black and white children. Federal. Anything related to the whole USA, rather than just one state. Your task then. Record the definition of each word, and then as an extension, should federal power be more important than state power? Explain your feelings why. Take a moment to complete those tasks now, so pause the video. Okay, this issue of federal power versus state power is central in American politics and was particularly important at this time. Perhaps the ultimate expression of federal versus state power was the American Civil War, in which the southern states wanted to exercise their so-called right to keep slaves. The North, of course, disagreed with this and wanted to fight to preserve the Union and get rid of slavery. A sort of hangover of that is the idea that some of the states, particularly in the South, felt that they should still have the power to segregate their communities. They felt that this was an issue that should be left up to the states, and that they should only desegregate if the states wanted to. The federal government disagreed, and felt that these were fundamental American rights that should be applied across the entire country. So, this competition between state power and federal power was usually one that came to a head. And I'll give you a bit of a clue: federal power generally wins. Let's consider the case of Elizabeth Eckford and the Little Rock Nine. Firstly, though, as a bit of a reminder of the Brown case. The Brown case refers to the Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas case of 1954 that ruled that segregation in schools had to end with all deliberate speed. In other words, the Supreme Court had ruled that segregated schools were unconstitutional. Little Rock, Arkansas was further ahead with desegregation than many other places in the Deep South. And that becomes quite ironic when we consider what happens next. Their governor, Orville Forbes, had been more moderate than some. This didn't mean that he was necessarily a supporter of civil rights, but more that he wasn't quite as extreme as some of his contemporaries. But, facing an election, he changed his mind. He needed to secure racist votes. Little Rock Central High School had 75 black pupils apply to join. It accepted 25 of them. Hardly desegregating with all deliberate speed, I'm sure you'll agree. After intimidation from white people, particularly the White Citizens Council, only 9 black pupils were still prepared to join the school. Forbes decided to use 250 state troops, these are the soldiers in the photograph from earlier, and they are not the Federal Army, to stop these 9 pupils joining the school. Again, I reiterate the idea that state troops or National Guard troops are not the same thing as the federal or professional US Army. They're more like part-time soldiers. The NAACP, or National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People, heard about this plan and told the pupils to come in the following day. One pupil, Elizabeth Eckford, did not get the message. She faced a murderous mob and rather than protecting her, the state troops sent her back into the mob until she was rescued by a sympathetic onlooker. This really was a potentially deadly situation for Eckford. So why was she ignoring all these reactions against her? Well, one reason might be that she had been trained not to react. By reacting against them, she would only be inviting further abuse and possibly violence. Your tasks then. Watch the Little Rock 9 video. The link is in the description. By the way, this is a pretty good video. Even though it's about 30 years old now, it's got some great interviews with people who were there at the time. But some of the things within it are truly shocking, so make sure you listen to the narrations very carefully. Why do you think that Forbes opposed integration at the school? Secondly, what do you find most shocking or surprising about the story? In what ways did Eckford and the rest of the Little Rock 9 show bravery? And lastly, does Little Rock show that the Brown case was only the start of desegregation? Explain why. So, go and watch that video and then complete these tasks. So pause the video now. Alright, why do we think Forbes opposed integration? Well, remember, black people didn't typically have the vote in these states, and so he wasn't looking to secure their votes. What he was trying to do, though, was secure the segregationist or white racist vote in the state. If he was threatened with not being elected at the next election, he may well turn to more extremist policies to try and secure these votes that he needed to win. What do you find most shocking and surprising about the story? Well, there are loads of things to choose from, aren't there? The one that sticks out for me is that suggestion by one of the police officers that they should let one of the black children be lynched in order to allow the others to escape. What a ridiculous and just unworkable idea. It almost beggars belief, doesn't it, that they would even consider such an idea as a practical solution to the violence. I'm also shocked as well at the footage of the black reporter being hit by the brick, and it does show that the extent of racism that black people suffered in the South at this time. Be under no illusion, that sort of action could easily have killed him. In what ways did Eckford and the rest of the Little Rock 9 show bravery? Well, think about the fact that they had very little protection from the official law enforcement agencies, especially at the start of this event. Not only that, the threats against them were very realistic. People really meant what they were shouting, and if they were telling them that they should be killed, they really meant it. So does this show that the Brown case was only the start of desegregation? I would argue absolutely yes. It is one thing to change the law and quite another thing to change the attitudes in the South and actually get the practical change that should result in. We're going to do some source skills now, and this will be linked to exam skills too. Study sources E and F. How useful are sources E and F for an inquiry into attitudes to integration in the Deep South? Use both sources and your own knowledge in their historical context. Bear in mind that this is an 8-mark answer, so you'll need to consider various things when you answer it, but we'll come back to that in a moment. However, the inquiry is into attitudes to integration, so keep that in mind. And by useful, we mean, do these sources give relevant information? Do they give enough information? And can we trust that information? Firstly, it's the photograph we looked at earlier. Elizabeth Eckford, one of the Little Rock 9, trying to get to Little Rock High School. It may help you to find your own copy of this picture and print one out that you can circle and annotate. It was taken on the 4th of September 1957. Then we got source F. This is from an interview given in 1991 by Daisy Bates. She was a key NAACP organiser who helped the Little Rock 9. Bates had been asked if she had the support of the parents of the Little Rock 9. Here's what she said. Oh, they, the parents, were completely behind us because I told them that we were taking a great chance, and the kids knew that they were taking a great chance because white people had gotten to where they were killing Negroes, you see. This was something entirely new in Little Rock, and they had said that they'd kill Negroes. A child meant nothing. So I told them one of us might die in this fight, and I said to them, if they kill me, you would have to go on. If I die, don't you stop. You might want to pause the video here and make some notes about these sources. In addition, when you come to answering this question, make sure that you've got both sources visible and you're able to refer to them directly. So here's how you would prepare your answer. Again, remember that you might want to flip back to the screen with the sources on it so you can refer to them. Firstly, consider, are you dealing with real information? What I mean by this is the information relevant? In this case, is it relevant to attitudes to integration in the Deep South? Does it provide you with enough information? Is the quality of the information good enough and detailed? What about the author? Can the author or creator of the source be biased? Are they aware of the facts? Does that in fact matter? Limitations. Is there anything about the source that it doesn't tell you? Well, consider as well whether or not there are any elements that you feel like you don't trust. Though I will say that both of these sources should be considered fairly reliable, so instead we're looking at the usefulness of the information within them. For each source, make notes under those headings, and then write your answer. You will need to explain a detail from each source that is useful for finding out about attitudes to integration in the Deep South. You could use PEEL for this. Remember, this is a structure that means make a point, give an example, explain the importance of that, and then link it back to the question. In this case, usefulness in relation to attitudes to integration. Then, explain reasons why each source might not give you all the facts that you need. Again, you can make a point, give an example, explain it, and link it back to the question of usefulness in terms of looking at attitudes to integration in the Deep South. And then you'll need to conclude overall. Explain overall how useful the sources are. Very useful, not at all useful, partly useful. Make a decision and don't sit on the fence. Okay, you can pause the video here and prepare your answer, and remember you can flip back to the earlier part of the video where the sources were visible. After that, we'll have a look at an example answer. So pause the video now. Okay, I forgot to mention that you should ideally spend about 12 to 15 minutes on that question, but no longer than that. So if you spent vastly longer than that, consider how much you wrote and whether you can do it any quicker. Here's an example answer. A reminder of the question. Study sources E and F. How useful are sources E and F for an inquiry into attitudes to integration in the Deep South? Use both sources and your own knowledge of the historical context. Both sources E and F concern the Little Rock Nine and integration of schools in Arkansas. Source E shows Elizabeth Eckford being verbally abused by a mob as she tried to attend Little Rock High School. So I've made my point and given my example so far. Additionally, there are state troops in the background. The state troops have been sent to Little Rock to prevent black pupils from attending. So further explanation of what I'm seeing. This is useful for showing us about attitudes to integration, as both Forbes's decision to send in state troops and the reaction of the mob show that there was opposition to integration in the Deep South. Well, that's where I've used an inference from the source rather than just the obvious information in order to link it back to the question of usefulness in relation to learning about attitudes towards integration. It's quite clear, isn't it, that source E shows that there was great opposition to integration in the Deep South. Source F gives similar information. The source describes how the NAACP worried that one of us might die in this fight, which reflects the looks of anger and hatred in source E. However, the families of the Little Rock Nines felt sufficiently strongly in favour of integration that they were completely behind integration. This source is useful as it shows us that white people were violently against integration, but black families were prepared to take risks in order to integrate, even if only a few families were prepared to take such risks. That said, neither source overtly tells us about the attitudes outside of the Deep South. Here's where I'm dealing with the limitations. Source E only shows those who were against integration, not others in Arkansas who might have supported it, as Arkansas was further ahead with integration than other states, which makes it less useful for judging the attitudes to integration. Similarly, Source F doesn't tell us about the black families who chose not to send their children to integrated schools, and why. Now I conclude by giving a judgment as to their usefulness overall. Overall, the sources are quite useful for showing attitudes to integration in the South. Many white people were clearly violently opposed to integration, and the sources show this. However, how typical the sources are of the entire Deep South might be called into question. Although I'm pretty sure our own knowledge by now will suggest that actually this is probably a pretty typical reaction within the Deep South. You can pause the video here and make any improvements that you feel you need to your own answer. Estimate how many marks you would get. Give yourself 4 marks for the way that you handle the sources, and 4 marks for your explanation. Remember as well that you should credit your use of the sources in relation to using your own knowledge to explain them. Mark your own work now, make any improvements that you want to, and then press play when you're ready to continue. How did the government respond? The images of rioting in Little Rock shocked the world and made the USA look bad, especially when the USA was trying to argue that they were the land of the free in comparison to communist Russia. Here's a picture of Dwight D. Eisenhower. He was the president between 1953 and 61. His attitudes to civil rights were really difficult to understand, but let's have a go. Eisenhower didn't believe in using the law to enforce integration. After all, he didn't believe that it would change people's minds. In other words, the president could change the law, but he couldn't necessarily change attitudes. Perhaps he was right in that respect. He had to act, though. He sent 1,000 federal troops to Little Rock. These were troops of the famous 101st Airborne Division. And those troops escorted the pupils into school to ensure that integration happened, so that federal law was enforced. This did nothing to stop the intimidation of pupils outside the school, though. Governor Forbes closed all the public schools in September 1958, only to reopen them in an integrated manner a year later in 1959. Your tasks then. Firstly, Eisenhower didn't believe changing the law would change people's attitudes. Do you agree with this view? As a challenge, refer to a real example from the topic to back you up. Federal troops are under the control of the president, not the state. Why might sending federal troops in be unpopular to the people of Arkansas? And do you agree that by September 1959, Little Rock was acting on the Brown decision? Explain your view. While you complete those tasks, you can pause the video now. Okay, I'm going to leave question 1 up to you. I'm not going to say whether there's a right or wrong answer to that, because you could argue either way. However, why might sending in federal troops be unpopular with the people of Arkansas? Well, remember this issue of states' rights versus federal powers. It would have seemed like to some people of Arkansas that the government was acting in a tyrannical way, enforcing a will against the state that they did not agree with. However, from the point of view of the government, all they were doing was enforcing the federal laws that had been decided and backed up by the Supreme Court decision in 1954. Do you agree that by September 1959, Little Rock was acting on the Brown decision? Well, if the school was integrated, then broadly, yes, it was. However, the conditions within the school might challenge that, and that's what we're going to be having a look at in a moment. Political opposition. In this photograph, we can see black parents taking their children into school under the escort of the police, who by that point were enforcing the Brown decision. White citizens' councils grew and continued to intimidate black families. This is something that we encountered when we looked at the Brown versus Board of Education case in '54. Many schools only let a few black children in at a time, so this was not done with all deliberate speed, this was deliberately slowed down. The KKK carried out intimidation and even some bombings. Some schools let black pupils in and then segregated their classes, which is not within the idea of what Brown was enforcing. Then some schools introduced entrance tests. They would then, of course, skew the results against black pupils to limit the numbers who were able to attend that school. Also, schools used racist violence to stop pupils attending, claiming that this was for their safety. So there would be racist violence and then the school would say, you shouldn't come here, it's not safe for you. Then the white citizens' councils made intimidating phone calls to black families, threatening them if they tried to integrate. This is typical of the intimidation and backlash that any progress seemed to get at the time. Your tasks then. Create a table with the headings violent resistance and subtle resistance. Subtle meaning sort of slight and not that noticeable. What would make subtle resistance so difficult to beat? Lastly, there were very few instances of black people fighting against the violence. Why do you think that they decided that fighting back would not work? Pause the video now while you complete those tasks. Okay, the growth of white citizens' councils is an example of violent resistance. Schools only letting a few children in at a time, however, could be seen as them complying with Brown, so that was more subtle. The KKK were violent. Schools letting black pupils in and segregating their classes is more subtle. Schools introducing entrance tests is also an example of subtle resistance. Schools using racist violence to stop black pupils attending and then claiming it's for their safety is sort of a combination of the two. It's the use of violence and then a subtle excuse for excluding them. And finally, the WCC's making intimidating phone calls is very much violent resistance. So why was the subtle resistance so difficult to beat? Well, very often it wasn't very noticeable, especially to people who weren't directly affected. And not only that, the subtle resistance actually often followed the law, and so it was really difficult to overturn. So why were there so few instances of black people fighting back against this? Perhaps part of it was down to the recognition that peaceful protests tended to work. But also there's the very real danger that these black families were under. They didn't need to give any other excuse to the white citizens' councils to physically attack them or for the KKK to attempt to murder them. And so, partly it was out of self-preservation and partly out of the understanding that it probably wouldn't have changed anything anyway. Coping with opposition. Read this list of rules. These were given as advice to black pupils integrating into white schools. Be clean and neat at all times. Be polite to the teachers and other students. Don't shout at or fight with anyone, no matter how provoked you are, and stick together. Sound and perhaps common sense advice, but very necessary for black pupils who might be facing various types of opposition in joining white schools, or previously white schools as we should now refer to them. Many white people who supported desegregation were themselves afraid to lend support to black people. It seemed that opposition came from everywhere. Pupils needed police escorts to get to school. To help people cope with this, CORE, which was the Congress of Racial Equality, produced a set of rules to help black pupils in integrated schools. These are examples of non-violent resistance. A couple of tasks then. Choose 1 to 3 of the rules. Explain how following them would help black pupils cope with opposition to their integration in school. Secondly, why can non-violent resistance be really effective in beating violent opposition? Explain your answer. You can pause the video now while you attempt those tasks. Okay, well, let's consider why non-violent resistance is so effective. If you're trying to show up your opponents as oppressors, one of the really useful ways of doing it is by acting with complete innocence and complete dignity yourself, while they are the ones who act extremely and violently. This only serves to highlight their violent actions and show how unjust they are. Nevertheless, we shouldn't kid ourselves and think that that would have been easy to do. Non-violent resistance is incredibly difficult, especially under sustained provocation, and indeed organisations like the Congress of Racial Equality provided training to black people in order to help them do that and to support them through that process. And on that note, we can conclude the lesson there, unless you want to have a go at one further piece of exam preparation, which we're going to do in the next few slides. If not, I'll say thank you for watching. If you are, let's have a look at what it involves. Here's an exam question. This is an explain type question with 12 marks. You'll get 6 marks for accurate knowledge and 6 marks for your analysis. Explain why civil rights campaigns were successful in getting rid of segregation in schools. You may use the following in your answer. Bear in mind that these bullet points are things that you may use, but you don't have to. Brown versus Topeka Board of Education, 1954, the NAACP and the Supreme Court. You must also use information of your own. And do bear that in mind. You cannot get all the marks for this question unless you use information in addition to those bullet points. So, as a mark scheme, this is how it looks. An analytical explanation is given which is directed consistently at the conceptual focus of the question, showing a line of reasoning that is coherent, sustained and logically structured. That's AO2 for explanation. What that really means in plain English is that your answer is focused on the success of civil rights campaigns in getting rid of segregation in schools and explaining why they were able to do it. An accurate and relevant information is precisely selected to address the question directly, showing wide-ranging knowledge and understanding of the required features of the characteristics of the period studied. So that's AO1 for your knowledge. So is your knowledge both accurate and quite wide-ranging about this period? It says no access to level 4 for answers which do not go beyond aspects prompted by the stimulus points. In other words, if you don't include your own knowledge, you cannot get full marks for that assessment objective. So bear that in mind when you're producing your answer. You'll want to produce probably 3 paragraphs of explained examples showing why these civil rights campaigns succeeded, which should include some sort of conclusion, including which was the most important factor or what overall theme meant that the civil rights campaign succeeded in this issue. You should spend between about 18 to 20 minutes on this sort of question, so you can pause the video now, plan out an answer, and then begin to write. Pause now. Done? Okay, let's have a look at an example answer to finish. There's the question again, and remember these stimulus points. Try and recognise where I've used them and where I've used my own knowledge. One way in which civil rights campaigns were successful in getting rid of segregation was with Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas Supreme Court case of 1954. In this case, several related cases were combined. The Supreme Court had to decide whether or not segregated education was inherently unequal and therefore unconstitutional. Supreme Court Justice Earl Warren successfully convinced the court that segregated education was unequal on the basis that it made black children feel inferior. This led to getting rid of segregation, as the court ruled that segregated schools were unconstitutional. So I've included some own knowledge on the ruling there and about Earl Warren as well. So that's getting me marks for AO1 in addition to what the stimulus point told me. This meant that schools had to desegregate with all deliberate speed, but some schools did not. Okay, this is my link between my previous paragraph and this one. In 1957, the NAACP supported attempts at integration by Little Rock High School, Arkansas. This was opposed by Governor Orville Forbes, who used the National Guard to prevent 9 pupils, including Elizabeth Eckford, entry to the school. Notice here that I'm giving my own knowledge about Little Rock. As a result, the NAACP lobbied President Eisenhower, who sent in federal troops to uphold the Brown decision. This was successful in desegregating schools, as it showed that federal rulings overruled state laws, and so the Brown decision had to be respected. Okay, my last bit now, where I'm going to conclude. The most important reason that schools desegregated was because of the campaigning of the NAACP. The NAACP's lawyers lobbied the Supreme Court and federal government to firstly ensure that segregation was recognised as unconstitutional, and then more locally based activists like Daisy Bates could support black Americans who wanted to exercise these rights. Okay, when comparing that to your own answer, note how I've integrated my own knowledge into some of the examples that were given in the stimulus points. I've also, at the end of each paragraph, tried to link it back to this question, or rather this issue, as to why were they successful. These linked sentences is really good for nailing down those AO2 marks. So, before you conclude this, have a look at your own answer, make any improvements that you can, and try and make an estimate as to how many of those 12 marks you managed to get. Perhaps you got all of them. And on that note, I hope this video has been useful to you. If it has, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. I'll be back with more content soon, and more on civil rights and other topics will be coming along very shortly. Thanks very much for watching, and goodbye.